"Ma'am, please step back from the controls," the assistant engineer shouted as Margaret approached the locomotive cab. He had no idea the 64-year-old ticket collector had 30 years of experience running subway trains through New York's most dangerous tunnels. But with 150 passengers racing toward disaster at 85 mph, she was about to show him what real railroad experience looked like. From which city in the world are you watching this story today? If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to Unseen Legends for more tales of hidden expertise walking among us. The California Zephyr cut through the Colorado Rockies like a silver ribbon against the autumn landscape, its diesel engines pulling 12 passenger cars through some of the most spectacular and treacherous terrain in North America. Inside the comfortable coaches, 150 passengers enjoyed panoramic views of snow-capped peaks and golden aspen groves, unaware that their scenic journey was about to become a fight for survival. In the lead locomotive, engineer Tom Bradley adjusted the throttle as they approached a long downhill grade toward the Fraser River Valley. At 52, Bradley had 25 years of experience with Amtrak, most of it on this challenging Denver to Grand Junction route. Beside him, assistant engineer Kevin Morrison monitored instruments and radio communications with the calm efficiency of someone still proving himself in the industry. "Beautiful morning for railroading," Bradley commented, watching elk scatter from the tracks ahead. The train was running smoothly at 79 mph, well within safety parameters for this section of track. Morrison nodded, but his attention was focused on the grade profile ahead. "We've got 8 miles of 2.2% downgrade coming up. Want me to start setting up for dynamic braking?" "Good thinking," Bradley replied. "Let's keep her under control from the start." Moving through the passenger cars with practiced efficiency, Margaret O'Sullivan checked tickets and answered questions from travelers. At 64, she moved with the steady grace of someone who'd spent decades working in moving vehicles, her practiced eye automatically scanning for safety issues or passenger concerns. To the travelers she served, Margaret was simply part of the railroad experience, a friendly face who ensured their tickets were in order and their questions answered. Her grey hair was pulled back in a regulation bun beneath her Amtrak cap, and her navy uniform bore the simple designation Conductor. What none of them knew was that Margaret O'Sullivan had spent 30 years as a subway train operator in New York City, navigating the most complex and demanding urban rail system in America. She'd operated trains through blizzards, blackouts, and emergencies that would have challenged engineers twice her age. "Tickets, please," Margaret said to a young family in Coach Car 3, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from decades of managing passengers in crisis situations. The father handed over their tickets while trying to keep his toddler from climbing over the seat. "How much longer to Grand Junction?" he asked. Margaret consulted her watch and mental calculation of their current position. "About 4 hours, sir. We'll be stopping in Fraser in 20 minutes for a crew change and brief passenger break." But as she spoke, Margaret felt something that made her pause. A subtle change in the train's rhythm, a variation in the sound of the wheels on rails that her experienced senses detected immediately. After 30 years of reading train behavior through vibration and sound, she could identify problems that electronic systems might miss. In the locomotive cab, engineer Bradley was discovering exactly what Margaret had sensed. "Kevin, I'm getting anomalous readings on the brake system," Bradley announced, studying his instrument panel with growing concern. Morrison leaned over to examine the indicators. "Air pressure looks normal. What kind of anomalies?" "Brake response is sluggish. When I apply service brakes, there's a delay before engagement, and the pressure drop isn't consistent with normal operation." As if to emphasize Bradley's concern, the train's speed began creeping upward despite his brake application. They were now doing 83 mph on a downgrade where they should be maintaining 75. "Try emergency application," Morrison suggested. Bradley pulled the emergency brake handle, and both men watched their instruments with mounting alarm. The brakes engaged, but not with the immediate, powerful response they expected. The train's speed decreased, but slowly, grudgingly. "This isn't right," Bradley muttered. "We should have full emergency stopping power." Morrison was already reaching for the radio. "Denver dispatch. This is California Zephyr eastbound, mile marker 184. We're experiencing brake system irregularities and request maintenance inspection at next station." "California Zephyr, Denver dispatch. Copy your brake concerns. Fraser station is equipped for basic maintenance. Reduce speed to 50 mph and proceed with caution." But as Bradley attempted to comply with the speed reduction order, he discovered their situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. "Kevin," Bradley said, his voice tight with controlled panic, "the brakes aren't responding properly to any input. We're accelerating through 85 mph, and I can't get reliable stopping power." Morrison stared at the speedometer as it climbed past 90 mph. At this speed, on this grade, with compromised braking, they were rapidly approaching a catastrophic situation. "How much downgrade ahead?" Bradley asked. Morrison checked their route profile with hands that had begun to shake. 6 more miles of 2.2% grade, then a sharp curve over Fraser River Bridge. Maximum safe speed for that curve is 45 mph. Bradley felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. Simple mathematics told the story. They were accelerating down a mountain grade with failing brakes, approaching a curve that would derail them if they hit it at their current speed. Contact dispatch with full mayday situation. As Morrison reached for the public address system, Bradley experienced what every engineer fears most, the moment when physics and mechanical failure combine to create an unsolvable equation. "This is your engineer speaking," Morrison's voice crackled through the passenger cars. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our braking system. Please remain seated and secure any loose items. We're working to resolve the situation." In Coach Car 3, Margaret O'Sullivan heard the announcement with the trained ear of someone who'd heard similar warnings before, but more importantly, she felt the train's continued acceleration through her feet and the way the car swayed on curves. She'd operated subway trains through situations where brake failure meant potential collision with other trains or platform accidents. The physics were the same whether you were under the streets of Manhattan or racing down a Colorado mountain. A train without proper braking was a guided missile looking for a target. Margaret made her way forward through the passenger cars, noting the rising anxiety among travelers who were beginning to understand that technical difficulties might mean serious danger. In the locomotive cab, Bradley was fighting a losing battle with controls that no longer responded predictably to his inputs. "Speed 94 miles and climbing," Morrison reported. "Air pressure showing normal, but actual brake response is maybe 30% of normal efficiency." "Dispatcher, this is California Zephyr with emergency traffic," Morrison transmitted. "We have catastrophic brake failure at mile 180, current speed 95 miles and accelerating. Request all traffic cleared and emergency response at Fraser Station." "California Zephyr, emergency response is being activated. Can you maintain control until Fraser?" Bradley and Morrison exchanged grim looks. Fraser was still 4 miles ahead, and at their current acceleration rate, they'd be doing over 100 miles per hour when they hit the curve approach. "Negative dispatch, we need alternatives. This grade and our acceleration rate put us over safe curve speed in approximately 6 minutes. That's when Margaret O'Sullivan knocked on the locomotive cab door. "Engineer Bradley?" she called through the door. "I'm Margaret O'Sullivan, train conductor. I have experience with brake system emergencies. May I assist?" Morrison looked at Bradley with desperation in his eyes. They were running out of options and time. Standard railroad protocol prohibited unauthorized personnel in the locomotive cab during emergencies, but nothing about their situation was standard. "Come in," Bradley called. Margaret entered the cab and immediately assessed the situation, with eyes trained by 3 decades of urban rail crisis management. She studied the instrument readings, listened to the engine sound, and felt the train's behavior through the floor. "What's your brake system status?" she asked, her voice calm despite the desperate situation. "Air pressure reads normal, but actual braking response is severely degraded," Bradley replied. "We can't maintain safe speed for the upcoming curve complex." Margaret moved to the brake controls and studied the configuration. "Have you tried manual brake valve override?" Morrison stared at her. "Ma'am, this is a complex locomotive. Manual override requires specialized training." "I have that training," Margaret said simply. "I operated subway trains in New York for 30 years. Different equipment, same principles." Bradley felt a spark of hope. Subway operators dealt with brake emergencies in confined spaces where failure meant catastrophic collision. If anyone understood brake system crisis management, it would be someone from that environment. "What do you need?" Bradley asked. Margaret was already studying the brake control panel with the focused attention of someone who'd memorized similar systems under pressure. "First, we need to understand if this is air pressure loss, valve malfunction, or brake shoe effectiveness failure." She moved to the manual brake valve controls that Morrison hadn't considered using. In subway systems, when primary brake response fails, you bypass automatic systems and go full manual control. "But this isn't a subway train," Morrison protested. "No, but pneumatic brake systems work on identical principles whether they're under New York City or in the Colorado mountains," Margaret replied, her hands moving over controls with practiced precision. She engaged manual brake valve override, bypassing the automatic systems that had been giving inconsistent responses. Immediately, both engineers felt the train's behavior change. "Speed reduction confirmed," Bradley announced with relief in his voice. "We're decelerating through 92 miles per hour," but Margaret wasn't finished. "The problem with manual override is you lose graduated control. It's all or nothing. We need to pulse the brakes to avoid wheel lockup while maintaining maximum safe deceleration." What she did next demonstrated why New York subway operators were considered among the most skilled train drivers in the world. Margaret began a rhythmic application and release of manual brakes, creating a controlled deceleration that gradually brought their speed down without triggering wheel lockup or brake overheating. Her timing was precise, developed through thousands of hours of experience managing trains in emergency situations. "Speed 85 miles per hour and decreasing," Morrison reported, his voice filled with amazement. "How are you doing that?" Bradley asked. "Pulse braking technique," Margaret explained while continuing her careful rhythm. "You apply maximum braking until you feel wheel resistance approaching lockup threshold, then release just enough to maintain traction. Repeat continuously." Through her feet and hands, Margaret could feel exactly when the wheels approached the edge of lockup, when brake shoes were overheating, when air pressure was rebuilding. It was a skill that couldn't be taught from manuals or simulators. This technique, she continued, was developed for emergency stops in subway tunnels where you have no margin for error. Lockup means collision. Overheating means brake failure. You learn to read the train's responses through vibration and sound. Bradley watched in fascination as Margaret continued her precise brake control, bringing their speed down to 75 mph, then 70, then 65. They were still above safe curve speed, but the rate of deceleration gave them hope of survival. "Margaret," Bradley said, "what's your background? I mean specifically." "New York City Transit Authority," Margaret replied, never breaking her concentration on brake control. "Line operator for 30 years, IRT Lexington Avenue line, mostly. Some of the most demanding train operations in the world." Morrison was beginning to understand the scope of what he was witnessing. "The New York subway system. You operated trains there. 8 million passengers a day, trains every 2 minutes, zero tolerance for operational failure," Margaret confirmed. "When brakes fail in that environment, people die. You learn to make manual systems work, or you don't survive as an operator." "Why are you working as a conductor on Amtrak?" Bradley asked. Margaret smiled grimly while continuing her brake control rhythm. "Because after 30 years of managing crisis situations in underground tunnels, I wanted to see mountains and sky. Conductor work seemed peaceful." "Speed 60 mph, Morrison announced. "Curve approach in 2 miles. Margaret adjusted her braking technique as they approached the critical section. "Now we need sustained deceleration without overheating. The curve requires 45 mph maximum, but I can get us down to 40 for safety margin." What followed was a demonstration of rail transportation mastery that neither engineer had ever witnessed. Margaret's hands worked the brake controls with surgical precision, reading the train's responses through vibrations that most operators would never notice. "Speed 50 mph, Morrison called out. "Fraser River Bridge visible ahead," Bradley announced. Margaret increased her brake pressure slightly, her experienced judgment calculating exactly how much deceleration they could achieve without triggering the wheel lockup that would send them off the tracks. 45 mph, Morrison reported. 42 mph and stabilizing, Bradley added. As they approached the curve complex that would have killed everyone aboard at their previous speed, Margaret O'Sullivan had successfully brought 150 passengers and crew through a crisis that should have been impossible to survive. The California Zephyr rounded the Fraser River curve at 40 mph, well within safety parameters, while Margaret continued her manual brake control to bring them to a complete stop at Fraser Station. When the train finally stopped, silence filled the locomotive cab for several seconds. "Margaret," Bradley said finally, "you just saved 150 lives." Margaret released the brake controls and sat back, her hands steady despite what they'd just accomplished. "Just doing what I was trained to do." But Morrison was studying her with new understanding. "Ma'am, what you just did isn't standard railroad training. That was expert-level crisis management." Margaret looked out at the Fraser station where emergency vehicles were already positioning to assist passengers. "When you operate trains in New York City for 30 years, you learn that every trip is a potential emergency. Equipment fails, people do unpredictable things, and the system never stops moving." "But why didn't you mention your experience when you hired on with Amtrak?" Bradley asked. "Because I applied for conductor position, not engineer," Margaret replied. "My New York experience was with different equipment, different regulations. I figured it was better to learn Amtrak procedures from the ground up." Over the following hours, as investigators examined the failed brake system and passengers were transferred to replacement transportation, Margaret's story began to emerge. She'd started with New York City Transit in 1985, one of the first women to operate subway trains in the system's most demanding assignments. The Lexington Avenue line carried more passengers than most entire transit systems, with trains operating at 90-second intervals during peak hours. For 30 years, she'd navigated situations that would have challenged the most experienced engineers: brake failures in tunnels, power outages during rush hour, medical emergencies on packed trains, equipment malfunctions that required split-second decisions to prevent catastrophic accidents. Her personnel file showed she'd successfully managed over 200 emergency situations during her career, including several brake system failures similar to what they'd just experienced. She'd received commendations for crisis management, innovation under pressure, and training new operators in emergency procedures. "Why did you leave New York?" Bradley asked as they waited for investigators to complete their interviews. Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching mountains that had nearly become their burial ground. "Because after 30 years of moving millions of people through underground tunnels, I wanted to work somewhere I could see sky, somewhere the pace was slower and the consequences of mistakes weren't quite so immediate." "But you brought all that experience with you," Morrison observed. "Experience doesn't disappear just because you change jobs," Margaret replied. "The principles of train operation, brake system management, emergency response, they're the same whether you're under Manhattan or crossing the Rocky Mountains." Bradley shook his head in amazement. "We had no idea we were working with someone of your caliber. That was intentional, Margaret said. I wanted to start fresh, learn Amtrak procedures without anyone making assumptions about what I could or couldn't do based on my background. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation would later determine that a manufacturing defect in the brake valve assembly had caused the gradual failure that nearly killed everyone aboard the California Zephyr. The defect affected dozens of similar locomotives and led to industry-wide safety improvements, but the investigators were particularly interested in Margaret's emergency response techniques. Mrs. O'Sullivan, the lead investigator, asked, "Your manual brake control technique isn't in any standard railroad operating manual. Where did you learn it?" "Trial and error in New York City," Margaret replied. "When you're operating trains every 90 seconds through tunnels where brake failure means collision, you develop techniques that aren't in textbooks. Would you be willing to help us develop training protocols based on your experience?" Margaret considered the request carefully. She'd left New York seeking peace and quiet, but the emergency had reminded her that her skills could save lives in ways that went beyond her daily conductor duties. "I'll help with training development," she said finally, "but I prefer to stay in my current position. I like working with passengers, and I like seeing mountains." 6 months later, Margaret O'Sullivan became Amtrak's first emergency response training specialist, a position created specifically to capture and share her unique expertise. She continued working as a conductor, but spent additional time developing crisis management protocols based on her 30 years of New York experience. Her training programs became mandatory for all Amtrak engineers and conductors, focusing on manual brake system override, crisis decision-making, and the kind of situational awareness that had saved the California Zephyr. "The most important thing," Margaret would tell new trainees, "is learning to read your equipment through senses beyond just instrument readings. A train will tell you what's wrong through vibration, sound, and behavior, if you know how to listen." Engineer Bradley requested Margaret as his regular conductor for the remainder of his career, knowing that having someone with her crisis management experience in the cab made every trip safer. "Margaret," he said during one of their regular runs through the Rockies, "I've been thinking about what happened that day. How did you stay so calm?" Margaret watched elk grazing in meadows that she might never have seen again if their emergency had ended differently. "Because panic doesn't solve mechanical problems. In New York we had a saying, the train doesn't care if you're scared, it only responds to correct technique." "But weren't you afraid?" "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "But fear is just information. It tells you the situation is serious. What matters is using that information to focus your training and experience on solving the problem." Years later, when Margaret finally retired from railroad service, Amtrak named their Crisis Management Training Center in her honor. The Margaret O'Sullivan Emergency Response Institute became the standard for railroad safety training across North America, but Margaret remained characteristically modest about her contributions. "I just did what I was trained to do," she would say when asked about her heroic intervention. Any experienced operator would have done the same thing. The truth was more complex. Margaret O'Sullivan had possessed a rare combination of technical expertise, crisis experience, and calm judgment that had turned certain disaster into survival. Her 30 years in New York's subway system had prepared her for a moment that lasted less than 10 minutes, but saved 150 lives. During the ceremony dedicating the training institute, Engineer Bradley spoke about the importance of recognizing expertise wherever it appears. "We almost missed the most qualified person on our train," he told the audience. Margaret O'Sullivan looked like a conductor, but she was actually one of the most experienced train operators in America. If we'd been too proud to accept help from someone whose official title didn't match her capabilities, everyone on the California Zephyr would have died that day. Margaret's story became required reading in railroad management courses, illustrating the danger of assuming that job titles accurately reflect people's capabilities and experience. The lesson, Margaret would tell her trainees, isn't that everyone should be prepared to take over a locomotive. The lesson is that expertise comes in many forms, and crisis situations require all available knowledge and skill. She'd learned something important during that emergency descent through the Colorado Rockies. You could change your job, your location, even your official responsibilities, but you couldn't escape the obligation to use your skills when people needed help. "Experience is a responsibility," she would tell new conductors. "When you know how to solve a problem that others can't solve, you have to step forward. The uniform doesn't matter, the job title doesn't matter. What matters is that people need help, and you're capable of providing it." Today, railroad operators across North America train with techniques developed by a conductor who spent 30 years moving 8 million passengers a day through the world's most complex subway system. Margaret O'Sullivan's emergency brake control methods are standard procedure, and her crisis management principles are taught to every engineer and conductor. But perhaps her most important contribution was demonstrating that the most extraordinary expertise often comes disguised as ordinary work. For 30 years she'd navigated some of the most demanding train operations in the world. Then she'd spent 5 more years quietly checking tickets and helping passengers, content to let others assume she was just another railroad employee. When crisis came racing down a Colorado mountain at 95 mph, Margaret O'Sullivan proved that true expertise doesn't retire. It just waits quietly for the moment when someone needs it to save their life. Sometimes the most capable person on your train is checking tickets in coach car 3. Sometimes the conductor who asks for your destination has navigated more dangerous situations than the engineer. Sometimes the woman in the regulation uniform has 30 years of experience that could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Have you ever discovered that someone's background was far more impressive than their current job suggested? Tell us about it in the comments below. And if this story reminds you to respect the quiet professionals around you, subscribe to Unseen Legends for more tales of hidden expertise. Because sometimes the person punching your ticket once guided millions of people safely through underground labyrinths, and when your train is racing toward disaster, that experience might be exactly what saves your life. This story is a work of fiction created to honor the spirit of professional expertise and the dedicated transportation workers who keep us safe every day. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.